If nature is made of nothing but unconscious matter, how come we're conscious? The way of thinking that made most sense to me came from Hindu philosophy. The idea there's a larger consciousness of which we're all part. Scientism is where people turn science into a kind of religion. It becomes a kind of dogmatic belief system. No purpose in a materialist universe, no God. It works mechanically, simply unconscious laws. And that means all religion's ridiculous. And I think it's no coincidence the endemic disease of modern industrial society is depression. Spiritual practices can actually help with all this. These are things that make people happier, life more fulfilling and richer. There's now been a lot of scientific research. I'm not saying become religious. What I am saying is try these spiritual practices, give them a chance.
This week on the show, we have Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, who is a biologist and author known for his theory of morphic resonance, and he has a brand new book out called Science and Spiritual Practices. I'll be honest, I love Rupert. He was on the show 5 years ago. He's been to my house for Thanksgiving dinner, and this is his most personal book ever. He talks about his own journey going to India and discovering religion and realizing that it doesn't conflict with him as a scientist. And he also teaches us that we need to adopt a lot of the religious rituals that we've kind of throw out when we reject religion. And that includes chanting, gathering, going on pilgrimages. And I love this episode. Rupert gets really personal, and I know you're going to love it too. And please adopt a bunch of these things into your life, whether it's gathering, giving thanks for your food, etc., etc. And of course, at London Real, we've got the Academy kicking off in about 2 weeks. We're starting our Business Accelerator program, our most popular course ever. If you want to go from nothing to your own business in 8 weeks, we are the best people in the world to do it. So watch out, those emails will be coming soon. And now I leave you with Dr. Rupert Sheldrake. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, the biologist and author of more than 85 scientific papers and 10 books, who's been ranked as one of the top 100 global thought leaders. You've studied at both Harvard and Cambridge University and been a research fellow for the Royal Society here in London. You're well known for your theory of morphic resonance, which states that memory is inherent in nature and that telepathic interconnections exist between organisms. Your new book, Science and Spiritual Practices, shows how science helps validate the 7 practices on which all religions are built and which are a part of our common human heritage. Rupert, welcome back to London Real.
Good to be here again, Brian.
It's a pleasure having you. It's been probably 5 years. We had an amazing conversation last time. I bumped into you probably 3 or 4 months ago in Hampstead Heath. I was out there running through the Heath after I jumped in the lake. I do this every weekend, every Saturday, but I saw you on a Sunday. And you walked by and you said hello, I don't think you knew who I was. And I said, "Hi, Rupert." And we started talking about nature and some of these pilgrimage walks that you've been making to different churches. And I was really fascinated with what you were talking about, but we were both in the Heath. And I kind of wanted to start there because I've been drawn to that lately and I don't know why. And you spend a lot of time there as well. And so I was wondering, why do you spend time there? And maybe you can tell me why I'm drawn to that place.
Well, both of us are lucky enough to live near Hampstead Heath, and most people don't have the chance to live near 1,000 acres of basically wild countryside in the middle of a city. I love going there because I find it very relaxing. It takes me completely away from my normal concerns. Walk a few yards onto the heath and there's grass, there's trees. It changes, of course, throughout the seasons. There's hawthorn blossom in the spring. It's just different every day, and the weather's different every day. So it's a reminder of a connection with nature, which I think is actually fundamental to all human beings. And making that connection on a regular basis, I think I find it relaxing. I think life would be very claustrophobic without it.
I come from a science background, and I know you have as well, and I want to talk a little bit about your journey, which you talk about in the book, and I never knew all the details of it, and so I'd love to walk us through that, and then talk about some of these 7 practices. But I was the kid in high school that did the science fair projects, and I never liked English or history. And then when I got to MIT, it was just more science and more engineering. And for me, I kind of rejected anything else. And I'll be honest, along with that kind of probably went some atheism as well. And with London Real, I've been introduced to some other ideas. And when you first came here 5 years ago and talked about morphic resonance, I was like, I don't know what this guy's on about. But in the past 5 years, I've tried to open my mind to lots of things because I'm drawn to the Heath. I've opened my mind to some psychedelic medicines. I've opened my mind to work of Mantak Chia and some things which I can't explain, I can't understand, but they feel right. And I was wondering if you could tell me about your journey with some of that. And does this sound strange coming from me?
Well, no, it doesn't sound strange, Brian. I don't mean how long, I mean how much of the journey. I did science at school. I was very drawn to science. Because I was very drawn to animals and plants. I think you were an engineer. Well, I was drawn to biology more than engineering. I kept a lot of pets as a child. My father was a herbalist and a pharmacist, so I learned a lot of plants from him, and he had a microscope laboratory at home. So I had an immersion really in the kind of natural history type of biology. So I did biology at school, and I liked it, but I did notice that the first thing we did in our biology classes was kill what we were studying. So biology is meant to be the science of life, but I soon realized it's actually the science of death, because you kill everything and cut it up. In those days, we did a lot of dissection. I think nowadays they do less in schools. And then I wanted to read science at Cambridge, so I did more biology at Cambridge. But I began to feel it was all too limited. I mean, it seemed to leave out all the things that most interested me, which is why when I had a chance to go to Harvard and do history and philosophy of science, I welcomed this chance to step back a bit and look at the bigger picture, which I did. And when I did that, it was soon after Thomas Kuhn's famous book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, had come out. And what Kuhn shows in that book is that at any given time in the world of science, there's a shared model of reality, a paradigm, he called it. And then there are periods of revolutionary change when the paradigm shifts, people move to a completely different model of reality. The best known example, of course, is the move in the 16th and 17th century from the idea that the Earth is at the center of the universe to the idea that the sun's at the center of the solar system, the Copernican revolution. And Darwin's theory of evolution is another one. Quantum physics is another one. But the biology is based on the mechanistic theory of life, the idea that living organisms are machines, They're inanimate mechanisms. They don't have feelings, they don't really have intelligence, they don't have consciousness. All this seemed to me completely implausible, having kept dogs and cats and birds and looked, you know, and liking animals, spending a lot of time with them. The idea they were just automata seemed to me completely implausible. And so when I discovered that this paradigm, this model, this mechanistic theory of nature, might just be a temporary model rather than ultimate truth, which is the way it was taught to me, I got quite excited. Science could change. It could be telling us something different. So actually a lot of my scientific career has been trying to find a bigger picture of reality, which treats living organisms as organisms and nature as alive.
Is that called scientism, when you believe so much in the science you've been taught that you refuse to believe something else and it becomes your religion in a way?
Yes, scientism is where people turn science into a kind of religion. It becomes a kind of dogmatic belief system. The irony is that a lot of people think that religion is dogmatic and science is free thinking. But actually, in my experience, some of the most dogmatic people I know are people who've made science into a kind of religion.
Not Richard Dawkins.
Well, he would count, yes.
And so your journey continued, and I believe that India played a big part in the evolution of your consciousness and spirituality. Can you talk about that? Because I was kind of fascinated to learn about the time you spent there.
Well, in 1968, I was traveling through India to Malaysia. I had a Royal Society research appointment at the University of Malaya to study rainforest plants. And on the way there, I just thought I'd stop for a few days in India. I didn't know anyone there, but I ran into, well, I did know one person there, but I didn't know where he was, and I happened to run into him a few days after I arrived in Delhi. And he was an anthropologist living in a remote village in the Himalayas, and he said, "Would you like to come to my village?" So I said yes, and so just within a few days of being in India, I was walking several miles from the nearest roadhead paths through fields to this remote village. No electricity, there was no radio, no television, of course, in those days, where people were living a very simple kind of life, but sophisticated, very sophisticated, the life of an Indian village. And I was staying with the family he lived with, the herbal doctor in the village. They made me really at home. I felt tremendously at home in India, and I felt, wow, this is the country that it's like coming home. I just felt this was the right place for me.
You said sophisticated, how?
Well, philosophically sophisticated, for example. I mean, there's a great respect for the Hindu scriptures and Hindu philosophy. And I went one day for a walk with my friend along a valley, and there was a stream and a waterfall, and by the waterfall was a cave, and sitting in the cave was this orange-clad holy man. So he invited us to go and talk to him and sit with him. So we did. Then he produced this little chillum, a pipe, a clay pipe. I'd not seen one before, and said, would I like to smoke Shiva's holy plant? And I didn't know what that was, so I thought, okay, well, I'll try it, here I am. It was in a particularly strong form of cannabis, which I hadn't had before. And he did an invocation to the god Shiva. This is like a kind of sacrament for sadhus. And so I smoked this, and I had this really strong cannabis experience, the first one I'd had. And I went outside from the cave, and I stood in the sunlight, and there were the Himalayas, and there was this beautiful valley, and I just felt completely blissful. It was like the high point of my life up to that point, a complete blissful feeling of connection and being at one with nature and the spirit and so on. So that for me was an enormous opening, and I realized that this kind of thing is normal in India. I mean, here's this holy man sitting there next to a village talking about the nature of consciousness, the nature of the mind. Simple villagers bringing him food every day because they like to feed these holy men, and appreciating his teachings. And instead of taking this drug, something you feel guilty about and smoking behind a bush because it's illegal and stuff.
Which would have happened in the UK.
Yes, whereas what happened there was that this was an accepted part of the culture and it had a spiritual dimension. Well, all of this was completely new to me, and as I travelled through India for the next 2 months, I realised that here was this vast civilization with this tremendous history, very different from anything I'd experienced in England, where people took seriously the idea of higher levels of consciousness. At that stage, through my scientific education, I'd become pretty atheistic, and I wasn't particularly open to any kind of religion, but in India it all seemed so attractive and so interesting. And when they were talking about the nature of the mind and consciousness, I realized that I didn't have any better theory from my scientific education. All I could say was that it must be something to do with nerve impulses and chemicals in the brain, but not a very sophisticated understanding.
Talk to me about meditation and yoga and the journey that you went on with those practices from India.
Well, after I'd been in India, I went back to, and Malaysia, I went back to Cambridge. I was a Fellow of Clare College, and I was doing research in science. And at that stage, the next thing that happened was discovering LSD, which I hadn't had before. A friend of mine had taken some, and in those days...
Probably legal then, in
the late 60s. It was illegal, yes. But
illegal?
Illegal.
Okay,
no,
illegal.
It was still, it had recently become illegal. Right. It was only fairly recently, because until then, it had been legal. And I had friends when I was in my hometown in Nottinghamshire, Newark. One of my friends there was a young doctor, and he was friendly with several psychiatrists. And at that stage, psychiatrists and young doctors were taking it at weekends, and it was legal, and it was like a scientific experiment. They were having a fantastic time. It had become illegal by the time I took it, but it was a kind of revelatory experience. I had a kind of death and rebirth experience. I felt I thought I'd taken a massive overdose. I was going to be insane for the rest of my life. I was scared. Thought I was in hell, and then I, as it were, came up to the surface, broke out into light, and I was in a state of complete bliss. And so this was a revelation that showed there was far more to consciousness than I'd ever experienced. And that led me to take up meditation around 1971, transcendental meditation. And they explained it at the teaching centre in Cambridge as just do it, here's how you do it, you don't need to believe anything, it'll affect the physiology of your body, your blood pressure, your heartbeat, etc. Just do it and see what happens. So I did, and I felt much calmer. I felt it a very helpful practice, and I did it twice a day for years. I only gave up when I had young children, and I found it was very hard to meditate in the morning with young children around.
And you remarked that the transcendental meditation, it worked for you even though there wasn't scientific proof of how it would work for you.
Yes.
And there wasn't a religion based with it, so it was quite unique.
Well, that was how they marketed it. I mean, of course it was a derivative of the Hindu religion. I mean, the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi who taught it was a Hindu holy man.
Yeah. I trained in TM as well.
Yes, well, they marketed it very skillfully. They marketed it as if you didn't need to believe in anything, you just do it and learn by experience. Right. That was fine by me. I wanted to learn by experience. Of course, since then, there's now been a huge amount of research on meditation, which I summarize in my new book.
Now, you do the transcendental meditation. How do you get back in touch with religion? And why do you need religion? You're a scientist, or you were a scientist.
Well, I am a scientist. I mean, I spend most of my time doing experiments. I've been doing one today. No, as a scientist, well, again, it's a long story. When I got back to Cambridge, a combination of meditation and psychedelics had this transformative effect on the way I saw the world. And the way of thinking that made most sense to me came from Hindu philosophy. the nature of consciousness being our consciousness being part of a greater consciousness which underlies the whole universe. That made sense to me. It made sense of the experiences I was having. More sense than the idea it's just inside my brain, the idea there's a larger consciousness of which we're all part. So I was so interested in Indian philosophy that when a chance came up several years later to have a job in India at a newly formed International Agricultural Institute, I applied for the job and got it. My title was Principal Plant Physiologist. So I spent 7 years in India working on crop improvement. I was doing, hopefully, I think it was useful work, helping to breed better varieties, helping to develop better cropping systems, helping poor farmers grow more food. So I was doing useful work as part of a scientific institute. But I was also exploring India and going to temples and hearing gurus and visiting ashrams and so on. And I was very drawn to this. I was very drawn to the fact that the Hindu religion brings together people in these festivals. They go on pilgrimages to holy places all over India. It engages the whole community in a way that brings people together, gives them a sense of purpose, connection, and meaning. I think religion does that. I think atheism doesn't do it. I think it gives a sense of separation. Your mind's nothing but your brain. You're in a purposeless universe. It's just mindless matter. There's no purpose, no particular meaning. When you die, it just goes blank. It's pretty depressing philosophy, and I thought, well, I shouldn't question it because it's depressing. If it's true, then you've got to put up with the depressing aspect. But I came to the conclusion it wasn't true because it just didn't have a good theory of consciousness. And so anyway, the Hindu thing was very attractive to me, and then I had some Muslim friends too. I learned Urdu, which is the Muslim language, in Hyderabad, where I was living. And then I had a Sufi teacher, a very elegant, elderly Sufi with a beard and wonderful robes and tremendous style and a great poet. And so I did Sufi meditation for a year, which I liked very much. And I liked going to the Sufi shrines in Hyderabad where they chanted songs called Qawwali every Thursday evening. There'd be groups of people singing this kind of ecstatic singing. So I loved that, and so that made sense. But then I realized I was drawn to these religions, but you know, I'm English. I couldn't really become a Hindu. You really have to be an Indian to be a Hindu.
Is that true?
No, you can. You can sort of convert to be a Hindu, but it's a bit artificial. You know, the holy places of Hinduism are all in India. And, you know, I'm English and more natural for me to relate to my own tradition. And becoming a Sufi in India, you've become a Muslim as well if you want to be a Sufi. I didn't really want to become a Muslim. So I realized that actually the best path for me to explore might be to re-explore my Christian path. So I did that, and I found it very easy to get back into it because I'd been raised Christian.
Okay.
And you know, I wasn't particularly committed at first. I just thought I'll explore this as another path. I mean, I explored so many others. Tibetan Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam. It seemed a bit discriminatory not to include Christianity. And I then met this wonderful English Benedictine monk who lived in an ashram in South India, where there was yoga, meditation every morning and evening. I used to sit on the bank of the sacred river Cauvery. It was a kind of hybrid of Indian and Western, and we chanted the Gayatri mantra and other Sanskrit mantras, and was vegetarian, sat on the floor, ate off banana leaves. Was in a small village, very much integrated with the local village life.
Sounds like a wonderful experience.
It was a wonderful experience.
Do you miss it?
I do rather. I spent 2 years there, and I wrote my first book there, A New Science of Life. So that was the book where I first put forward the idea of morphic resonance.
Okay. Which was now that I listen to it, that was because of all these experiences, right?
Well, I had the idea of a memory in nature when I was in Cambridge before I went to India to live there. I arrived at it through working on how plants grow, how form arises. That was what I was doing research on. And I realized that there had to be some kind of form-shaping influence in plants. What makes an oak leaf and a beech leaf a beech leaf? They have the same kinds of chemicals, the same hormones, yet they're different shapes. The same in our bodies. What makes an arm and a leg a leg? They've got the same DNA, the same proteins, the same chemistry. I mean, they're chemically identical, yet they have different shapes. So it's a bit like buildings. You can build out of bricks and cement and timber. You can build different shaped buildings, go down a suburban street, and there'll be lots of houses. They look different, but they're built out of the same materials. So it's not the materials, the molecules that shape it, it's something else. So within biology was the idea of morphogenetic fields, which are form-shaping fields. I got very interested in that. I didn't invent that idea. It'd been around for 50 years or more. But I had the idea that these fields must be inherited, not through DNA, which is to do with the inheritance of proteins, but in some other way. And then I realized if there was a kind of memory in nature, a huge number of phenomena would become much easier to understand. And that was really the germ of the idea of morphic resonance, which I had in Cambridge. But it was obvious it was going to be very controversial scientifically. And when I discussed it with friends in my college and in the biochemistry laboratory where I worked, it was clear that most people didn't take it seriously and treated it as a kind of joke.
How do you deal with that? Because you've never been afraid to put these controversial ideas out there.
Well, I realized that I couldn't, if I was going to put out an idea as controversial as this, I had to be much better prepared than just having the idea. I had to think about it for a long time to see if it really held up. I had to look at the evidence and see whether there was already evidence for this. I had to see how it fitted in with physics and chemistry, and I had to think it through. I was doing that while I was working in India in the Agricultural Institute. In my spare time, I was thinking about this and reading and discussing it with people. And the funny thing is, you see that whereas in Cambridge, most people thought this was a kind of incredibly shocking new idea, when I discussed it with my Hindu friends, most of them said, oh, there is nothing new in this idea. They said, ancient rishis have said this thousands of years ago. The idea of a memory in nature is pretty standard in Hindu and Buddhist philosophy. So I was suddenly found myself living in a culture where people didn't find the idea shocking at all. They thought the basic idea must be right, but they weren't very interested in trying to prove it scientifically, because they would just say, sure, it must be right. What's the point proving it? So I had the exact opposite problem in India from the one I had in Cambridge. In India, I just couldn't persuade people that it was worth doing experiments or testing it, whereas people in Cambridge said, it's such a crazy idea, where's the evidence? Anyway, when I finally got to write this book in Father Bede's ashram in South India, for me it was a perfect combination, living in a contemplative community where it was a very happy community, and here was this marvelously radiant, holy man who was just a totally good person, incredibly bright and intelligent, and yet radiated this kind of mystical holiness. I mean, in a very open way, he could talk to anyone. He could, so here was this marvelous person. Here was this happy community. Here was sort of regular meals. I was living simply. I had plenty of time to think and to write. I lived in a palm-thatched hut under a banyan tree. As I was living extremely simply, it cost me, by contributing my keep to the ashram, about $250 to live for a year and a half. That was my first stay there. And then I stopped worrying about money. I thought, I've already got enough in the bank to live here for the rest of my life if I want to. So that dissolved any money worries, and I discovered I could live very happily on very, very little money. So a combination of a community, regular meditation, chanting and singing, which is a very important spiritual practice, prayer, thinking, writing. It was a very good mixture for me, and at no stage did I feel there was a conflict between science and religion or spirituality.
Okay. Something we haven't talked about yet is materialism. And where does this come in? Because it seems like it might kind of go alongside of this scientism, atheism. Does materialism come next? Because, you know, there's a lot of that going on in the world, at least there is on the media channels that I look at on the internet. There seems to be a lot of this. What is your take on that?
Well, materialism has two meanings. Firstly, it's a philosophical theory that became predominant among intellectuals in the late 19th century. And as a philosophical theory, it says the ultimate reality is matter. That's why it's called materialism. Matterism. Matter's the only reality, the ultimate reality. The whole universe is made of matter and nothing but matter. And the matter's unconscious, it works mechanically, it follows mathematical laws, is completely impersonal. Insofar as evolution takes place, it happens by blind chance and natural selection. There's no purpose in a materialist universe, no God, no guiding principles that are conscious, simply unconscious laws and forces. Well, that's the doctrine, and that became predominant within science in the late 19th century. And as a doctrine, it works quite well for a technological civilization. You know, if you've got a civilization that's all about engineering and machines and progress through gadgets and technology, jet planes and the internet and smartphones and things, as a philosophy it works pretty well, but it doesn't work very well if you ask the question, well, why are humans conscious? Why is there any consciousness in the universe? Because if nature is made of nothing but unconscious matter, how come we're conscious? And in the philosophy of mind, that is called the hard problem. The very existence of consciousness is a problem for materialism. It gets rid of God and angels and other forms of consciousness from the worldview, but it hasn't got rid of human consciousness. And some materialists pretend that we're not really conscious. Some pretend our consciousness is just an illusion. But that doesn't explain it, because illusion is a mode of consciousness. It's a really big problem in the very heart of science, and there's a lot of thinking about this going on at the moment. Consciousness studies are now a very big part of science.
Yeah, where is that right now? How do you explain consciousness or define consciousness or prove it?
Well, I'll come back to that, but I'll just deal with the second meaning of materialism. The second meaning, in like everyday speech, is where people say, people are very materialistic if they just want to buy things and go to shopping malls and have stuff and are concerned about money and things. Well, that's the everyday thing, and most people who use it in that sense aren't aware that it's a whole philosophy of nature. But the two are related, because if you think matter's the only reality, then buying stuff seems like the best kind of thing to do.
The ultimate more reality.
So anyway, to come back to consciousness, the traditional opponent of materialism in Western philosophy is called dualism, and that's what science started out with in the 17th century, modern science. The whole of nature is mechanical, unconscious matter. But there is also in nature something which is non-material, which is conscious spirit, which is completely immaterial and not in space and time. And there's three kinds of conscious spirit. Firstly, God. Secondly, angels. And thirdly, human minds. And so that view, which is called dualism or Cartesian dualism after Descartes, who was the first person to put it forward, a 17th century philosopher in France. This philosophy, it says that the whole of nature works exactly mechanically, just like science says it does, but then there's this kind of add-on of God and angels and human minds, which are based on reason, that aren't really in space and time. But it doesn't explain how God or angels can possibly relate to a mechanical natural world. So in the 19th century, the materialists said, oh, well, let's just get rid of this realm of spirit, get rid of God and angels, and that means all religion's ridiculous. And that meant that revolutionaries like the French revolutionaries and later the Russian revolutionaries could undermine the power of the church, which they thought was propping up reactionary states, by saying, well, the whole thing's a sham and a pretense, and there's no God, there's no meaning in any of this. And so it became, materialism led to a kind of political atheism, which was liberating in many ways, but which created this hard problem. If you get rid of all forms of consciousness from the universe, except human consciousness, you're then left with the problem of how do you explain it? So we get to the hard problem. And I myself don't like the materialist theory because, I don't like that, and I don't like the dualist theory either because it has kind of separate consciousness.
Right.
So what's happening at the moment is an interesting development of a lot of materialists who are feel they're stuck with this materialist view. They can't explain human consciousness. Some of them, after all, meditate and carry out spiritual practices are becoming quite common among atheists.
Is that like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or their closeted life of meditation? I mean, how do they explain it if they're a materialist?
Well, they think it's all happening inside the brain.
Okay.
You see, a typical example is Sam Harris, who's one of the so-called new atheists.
Yeah.
He's an ardent meditator. He spent 2 years in India visiting gurus and being initiated into meditation.
And you disagree with him by him saying it's only mental and he's ignoring the spiritual?
Yes. Where he and I would agree about its value. The point is, in my book, one of the practices I discuss is meditation. And there's now a great deal of scientific evidence that it's good for you. It helps people. It acts against depression. It lowers blood pressure. Helps deal with insomnia. People who meditate are happier and healthier on the whole than people who don't. If they're comparable kinds of people. It's a beneficial practice, which is why you can now get a prescription for it on the British National Health Service. Oh, yeah. People who have mild or moderate depression. So quite a lot of atheists now meditate, and Sam Harris is one of them.
And you think he needs to look at it differently?
Well, the thing is that we don't quarrel about the experience, but the meditation grew out of Buddhist and Hindu and Christian and Sufi traditions, where it was about going to the ground of your mind, letting go the passing thoughts and getting to the place in your mind from which these thoughts are going through. It's like the arena of consciousness in which you're thinking and through which these thoughts are passing. It's like stepping back. And then you realize there's something in your mind which is the basis of your consciousness. And that, in all traditional systems, is an aspect of God's consciousness. You're actually directly contacting the divine consciousness. Now, for atheists who meditate, they'd say, no, it's not that at all, it's just inside the brain. It's nothing but changes in nerve cells and nerve endings.
Alpha waves, gamma waves.
Neurotransmitters, dopamine levels, and so on.
And you're not buying it.
All these things do change in the brain.
Right.
And it's obviously hard to decide whether it's more or less than a greater consciousness or whether it's just the brain on the basis of meditation itself, because a lot of meditators are atheists, a lot of meditators do have a religious or spiritual view.
Okay.
I think there are other reasons for looking at, there are other ways of looking at this picture. Where I think the difference becomes greatest is with prayer. Practically no atheists pray, according to recent surveys, which makes sense, because if you believe there's no consciousness beyond your brain, then there's nothing to pray to. Whereas all religions have prayer as part of them, the idea that our consciousness can relate to a greater consciousness than our own. And there are lots, in Britain about a third of the population pray quite regularly, far more than actually go to church. I mean, it's a much more common practice than meditation as well. But there's where you get a real difference, where between prayer and meditation, because prayer can't just be inside your brain if it's going to be what it seems to be, namely a relationship with a greater form of consciousness.
Let's talk about this word religion, because in the last 50 years, at least when I've been alive, when you mention it, there's a phobia to it, there's a rejection of it. And kids these days, I'm starting to sound old when I say that, when you mention it to them, I don't know, because of bad press or because of materialism or scientism or atheism, people a lot of times have a knee-jerk reaction of, oh no, I don't believe in that, that's an old way of thinking, that's something I don't like, my parents tried to get me there, I don't relate. I'm sure you know this.
Oh yes, of course.
Why does that happen? And obviously I think your book is a way of telling people that that's not necessary to reject it, since there's all of these amazing benefits in these thousands of years of religion. And I want to get into these other practices, but why is that reaction there? You must have thought long about it, and how can we get around that?
Well, I had that reaction myself, so I'm very familiar with it.
Yeah.
I think for me, when I had that reaction, it was the idea that science represents sort of reason, progress, moving forward, and religion just sort of holds us back in a sort of ancient way of thinking, which we've grown out of as humans. That was the kind of progressivist, materialist, atheist view. And then there's a lot of atheist propaganda against religion, which a lot of people just absorb by a kind of osmosis. It causes wars and conflicts, dogmatic, people are manipulated, etc. Well, I mean, those is true. There have been religious wars and conflicts, but often people say that as if that's, religion's particularly bad. But actually, when you look at atheism, when it becomes a political force, in Stalin's Russia, how many people died, except outside the wars? 20 or 30 million died in the Second World War, but 20 million, 30 million people perished as a result of Stalin's policies. In Mao's China, again atheist, about 40 million perished. In Pol Pot's Cambodia, 2 million out of a population of 6 million. So atheism itself has a pretty murderous history when it's achieved political power. And in the French Revolution, when it was first burst onto the scene, they closed all the churches, persecuted religion, guillotined priests, abolished monasteries. So it's not as if atheism's track record is free of blemish. What I think this shows is that all human institutions and religions and philosophies and governments and nations are all human institutions, are fallible and can be taken over by people who can exploit the power in a bad way. So personally, I don't think that the historical arguments are conclusive against religion. I mean, religions have also brought about a lot of very good things. Closer communities, the tradition of helping others. In the Christian case, the church started schools and universities and hospitals and hospices. I mean, all these things were started first by religious people, not by atheists. So there's been a tremendous legacy of good works and people who help others. And even today, when there's a big call on people's charity, when there are disasters, religious people make much bigger contributions than atheists.
Mm. And so the purpose of this book is to outline 7 of the practices that most religions are drawn to, or are most people that in religions, as you looked at them use. And that's meditation, gratitude, connecting with nature, relating to plants, rituals, singing and chanting, and of course pilgrimage.
Yeah.
Is that why you wrote the book?
I wrote the book because I think a lot of people in the modern world who've given up religion, and in Britain, for example, the percentage of people who regularly go to church is now about 5%. Wow. In a survey this year, for the first time, more than 50% of the population said they had no religion. Now, there's never been a situation in the whole history of the world before where the majority of the population have left or abandoned religion. It just hasn't happened. It didn't happen in Europe in the past. It doesn't apply in the Middle East. It doesn't apply in India. It doesn't apply in most places.
Even America.
In America, America's much more religious. About 40 or 50% of people go to church on a regular basis there, compared with 5% here.
Okay.
And
so this shows you what? This alarmed you?
No, that a lot of people who, if you stop going to church and abandon religion, then you stop joining with other people and singing with them on a regular basis. You stop having a centre of your community where you all meet up and try and help others. You stop celebrating the festivals which give a kind of meaning and structure to the year. You stop praying, which for many people is a great source of strength and helps them. You stop meditating if that's part of a religious tradition. You stop going on pilgrimages because you know there's no point in going on sacred journeys if you don't believe in the sacred or the holy. You stop a whole range of, you stop giving thanks before meals or expressing gratitude because there's no one to express it to if you don't believe in anything greater than yourself. So people who stop all those things and accept a worldview that their mind is nothing but their brain, we live in a pointless, unconscious universe, there's no particular meaning in anything, there's no purpose in evolution. It's a depressing worldview. And I think it's no coincidence that modern societies, the endemic disease of modern industrial society is depression.
Continue watching this fascinating conversation for free by clicking on the link below to visit our website, and I'll see you on the inside.